Hey folks, welcome to another episode of Cutter One. I am your host, Jay, just Jay, your resident culture warrior and your resident troublemaker. All right, so we got a long one this time, and it's a subject I don't know. I was kind of like iffy about whether or not I wanted to talk about it, but I think we should. I think it needs a good talking about. So let's get right into it. All right, this is coming to us from the Los Angeles Review of Books. Okay. And it is Multiculturalism in Middle Earth on Amazon's The Lord of the Rings, The Rings of Power. All right. J.R.R. Tolkien had an Atlantis complex. A vision of a gigantic wave engulfing a green landscape informed his dreams and memories, or so he claimed. Had the great fantasy writer narrowly escaped a natural disaster? A tsunami in his native South Africa, perhaps? Or in the English archipelago, where he had lived since early childhood? No. The flood in question is a foundational episode in Tolkien's intricate fictional mythology of Middle-earth. Within that hierarchical, genealogy-driven white world, the highest-ranking humans migrated to Middle-earth from an island called Numenor, whose inhabitants have ancestors that included elves, the most exalted of all creatures. The most elite of humans, the Numenorians, generate an exceptional civilization, thanks to the overweening pride and willfulness of certain leaders, though the gods destroy the island through a watery apocalypse that forever sinks it. However, a small band of Numenorians managed to escape to Middle-earth, led by the heroic chieftain Elendil and his sons. Remarkably, it is this mythic flood of his own invention in which Tolkien believed as if it were a memory. As Tolkien put it, quote, "It is things of racial and linguistic significance that attract me and stick in my memory," unquote. And that memory, apparently, was as historical as it was mythic. The fabulist thought that, thanks to his own imagined connection to an ancestral line that extended to Elendil himself, he possessed a genetic memory of that ancient flood. All right. I think she's reading, this author is reading way too much into that. The implication that Tolkien somehow thought he was like historically, all right, anyway. For me, the most satisfying moment by far of The Lord of the Rings, The Rings of Power, Amazon's expensive adaptation of Tolkien's Second Age, involves Numenor and a dramatization of Tolkien's terrible dream. The fourth episode of the blockbuster series, called The Great Wave, opens with a vision of huge waves crashing over and drowning the Numenorian city of Armenelos. Sorry, it's Monday. Cut me some slack. Armenelos. Yet, this dream also clashes deliciously with the supposed memory that Tolkien so cherished. Tolkien understood his dream as part of a racial pattern of white father-son affinity that began with Elendil and his son and extended up to Tolkien and his own child, Michael. In his appendices, for which Amazon gained the rights from the Tolkien estate for a whopping $250 million, Tolkien highlights the racial purity of Elendil's ancestral line in Middle-earth, writing that, quote, "It was the pride and wonder of the northern line that, though their power departed and their people dwindled, through all the many generations, the succession was unbroken from father to son." Elendil is one of the white characters in the Amazon series, played ably by Peter Mackenzie. In The Rings of Power, though, it isn't Elendil, but rather a woman of color, Queen Regent Muriel, realized beautifully by Cynthia Addai Robinson, who dreams of the Great Flood. Moreover, Muriel's vision of Numenor radically rejects the white patriarchal bonds embraced by Tolkien. The tsunami hits the island while the queen is blessing newborns brought to her by an emphatically multicultural group of mothers. It's hard to imagine an adaptation that would have bothered Tolkien's racist sensibilities further. There it is. There it is, folks. There it is. We are 3 paragraphs in. He's a racist and apparently a misogynist, because of his, patriarchal visions. Patriarchal bonds. But yeah, okay, 3 paragraphs in. As I have discussed, Tolkien was both a Little Englander who detested globalism and a medievalist who dissuaded his Jamaican advisee at Oxford, none other than the future multiculturalism pioneer Stuart Hall, from becoming a medievalist. As medievalists of color such as Mary Rambaran Ulm have made clear, the whiteness of medieval studies remains a vexing problem. If Tolkien could not tolerate the prospect of a black scholar analyzing his treasured medieval English literature, how much more would he have rejected the very idea of a black Númenórean woman, let alone one who shared his Atlantis dream? The diverse bodies involved in the Queen's vision are part of an overall effort by the makers of the Rings of Power to reimagine Tolkien's world as a place where a hobbit, a human, and even an elf can be non-white. That casting decision reflects, in turn, a larger shift in Western cultural politics in which stories long associated with whites are portrayed in more inclusive terms. A shift whose flashpoints include Lin-Manuel Miranda's Hamilton, 2015, as well as recent installations of the Star Wars franchise and Netflix's Bridgerton. This shift is welcome for many reasons, but it also has occasioned predictably troubling conflicts between fandoms and new adaptations. All right, so basically the gist of her thing is, and I'm sure some of you have heard this before, Tolkien, because he didn't explicitly make black characters, is a racist piece of shit, and the fact that we're modernizing his writing and inserting tokenized people of color in here, because it's the quote unquote woke thing to do, that's somehow a positive thing. To which my argument is, if you can't enjoy Tolkien without seeing people whose skin color matches yours, then you're the fucking racist. It's as simple as that. Because I don't read Tolkien and go, oh, they must be like this. I try to imagine what they look like based on what Tolkien describes, okay? The other thing I tend to point out to people who try to make this argument, like, well, Tolkien stuff was so like Eurocentric, and it's based in that, white Europeanism and stuff like that, because the man was white and European, okay? If the man had wrote something that was, African based or based on cultures from South America or stuff, we would accuse him of cultural appropriation. Okay. We often say that, Hollywood writers should, the white writers should not be writing stories for people of color because they can't fully understand it. They can't fully grasp it because apparently, the color of your skin makes you, not be able to grasp that somebody else might be going through in their life. But, for instance, the actress that played Phoebe on Friends, when they were talking about how Friends was too white, okay, her response was that, she was glad that the writers didn't try to write quote unquote black stories because they were all white writers, and how could they with any legitimacy write black stories? Okay, fine. Let's take that argument. Then in turn, how can you complain that Tolkien's work is too white or Eurocentric when he was a white man? He wrote what he knew. If I write a book right now, the characters will largely be white. Why? Not because I'm being overtly racist, not because I'm trying to exclude anybody, because it's what I know. Okay? And if somebody wants to write a story and they are of African descent or of Latino descent or Arabic or Asian descent, and their characters are largely based on those cultures, African, Latino, Asian, but that's what they know. You write what you know, and it's really annoying as a Tolkien fan, and I'm sure you guys will let me know in the comments, but it gets really annoying because you have these quote-unquote experts that are basically saying that if you do not look at the bulk of his work through the lens of racism, okay, through the lens of race, then you're somehow okay with his racism because he wrote a story based on what he knew, on his experience. Okay, so where's the line then for cultural appropriation? Okay, if I see a story that's, let's take the, what was it, the warrior, the Woman King. The Woman King. That was a recent movie from like last month. Let's take The Woman King. Okay, are we saying that story? Okay, it's too Pan-African. It's too African in nature. No, it's a story about African people in Africa. It should be, okay? The cast should largely be African, okay? So can I complain about the lack of diversity in that film? No, not really. Not if I want to have any semblance of legitimacy in my argument. It just doesn't make any sense. So to turn around and say that a man who wrote a story, okay, throughout his life, but I believe the first publishing of The Lord of the Rings was actually in 1954, but The Hobbit was prior to that. I believe the beginnings began in 1917. To turn around and say that a white guy from Europe who wrote a story back in 1917 or had the beginnings of a story in 1917, to somehow complain that it's too white is asinine. Yes, I'm saying it's asinine. And if you can't enjoy Tolkien because there's nobody that quote unquote looks like you, well, then you don't need to be enjoying Tolkien. I'm sorry. There are plenty of stories where characters don't look like me, and I'm totally okay with it. Doesn't determine whether or not I can enjoy the story. People like this are ridiculous, but okay, I'm getting too heated, getting worked up here. All right, so let's keep going. All right. Let's see, where are we? Okay, yes. All right, shoot, go away. Okay. The diverse bodies involved in the Queen's vision are part of an overall effort by the makers of the Rings of Power to reimagine Tolkien's world as a place where a hobbit, a human, and even an elf can be non-white. That casting decision reflects... go away. There we go. That casting decision reflects, in turn, a larger shift in Western cultural politics in which stories long associated with whites are portrayed in more inclusive terms. Can I ask a question? Why is it only the stories that are largely associated with whites are need to be more inclusive? Okay, I'm just curious. I'm just curious at how we would feel if a story that was historically largely Latino, can Asians then say, hey, you need to have more Asians in that? Can whites say, hey, you need to have more whites in it? I don't understand where this mindset comes from that, okay, there's a certain percentage. Are we going for quotas now? If that's the case, the United States is at least 66% white people. So that would mean 6 out of every 10 characters need to be white. I would think in a lot of shows, you'd be having more white people than you currently see on screen. But I digress. All right, flashpoints include... Okay, yep, we read through that. Okay, as anyone familiar with the popular reception of the Rings of Power well knows, its diversification of Middle-earth has drawn criticism from a sizable and vocal group of fans who are attached to the whiteness of Tolkien's fantasy world and have decried the new series. No, it's not being attached to the whiteness of it. It's being attached to the lore of it. Okay, it's sticking to what the man wrote. Okay, if the man wrote that there were characters of color, okay, who were quote unquote not white, then they should be in there. Okay, and like I said, I would have loved if they had used this opportunity to show us the Easterlings, okay, and to show us the Haradrim. Okay, I would have loved it, and you could have had a largely non-white cast for those, for those shows. Okay, but that they didn't want to do that. They wanted to bank on the member berries from the Peter Jackson films. Among the effects of this outcry is a paradoxical boon for the makers of the Rings of Power, insofar as the spectacle of trolling might allow Amazon to reject any criticism of the show as somehow rooted in racism. Yes, that is a tactic. Any criticism becomes racism. Pointing out facts and asking questions are racism. There might even, I wouldn't be surprised if there's some people in the comments that are going to accuse me of being racist because of the things I've said. And the things I've said are just pointing out facts and asking questions. In fact, the Rings of Power suffers from so many artistic issues that it's hard to single one out, though perhaps its overblown orchestral and choir-heavy music is a strong contender. Actors such as Ismael Cruz Cordoba, the fantastic leading man Elf Arondir. He's not a leading man, honey. They went with Elrond and Galadriel. See my other video. Joseph Maule, the wonderfully evil Adar, and Owain Arthur, the big-hearted, I'm assuming they mean dwarf Prince Durin, deserve a good deal of praise for eking strong performances out of impoverished dialogue, plot lines, and set designs that don't do justice to the narrative strengths of Tolkien's secondary world, such as its moments of thrilling adventure. But in addition to such aesthetic concerns, it's also worth considering just how much The Rings of Power is also true to Tolkien's racist vision in works like The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings. Not unlike Jeff Bezos himself, Tolkien was a world maker, and fundamental to his fantasy world was its organization on behalf of whiteness. No, fundamental to his fantasy world was its organization on behalf of what he knew. As a white guy, that will default to quote-unquote whiteness. As a black woman, that would default quote-unquote to black feminism. Okay? And I don't mean that in the political sense of feminism, but I mean, again, what I said earlier. You write what you know. Okay? So to assume Tolkien wrote, quote-unquote, on behalf of whiteness is asinine. The immensely enjoyable conflict between good and evil forces in the Tolkien universe take shape through the elevation of brightness over darkness, light over shadow, high over low, white over black. And unfortunately, the makers of the Rings of Power, for all their putative investment in diversity, by and large hold steady to that larger vision of the world structured in white dominance. Oh no, you clearly did not watch the show. You clearly did not. Okay, the main characters aside, where they ethnically changed them, okay, they did other things. The orcs, way whiter. They brightened the orcs for this show in the name of diversity. They also made the Southlanders, okay, who should be a more diverse, darker skinned group of people, okay, all seem to be real white. It's interesting how all the bad guys or potential bad guys or followers of the bad guys tend to be them, evil white folk. But I digress. World structured by white dominance. The opening credits of the series signpost these color-charged stakes. Inspired by the angelic music said to create the original beings and objects in Tolkien's universe, the credits use sound vibrations, in technical parlance, cymatics, to create shifting patterns with golden sand upon a black background. Choral harmonies soar in tandem with harps, violins, and other strings as rings, trees, and other shapes emerge and recede. Suddenly, the camera closes in on a new black river of sand that snakes its way into the golden shapes as the music turns sinister and ominous. Here, before the narrative even begins, the credits clarify its basic structure as a tale of golden, beautiful, and good world threatened by corrupted by incursions whose maliciousness is of a piece with their blackness. No. Okay. There's reasons why quote unquote blackness is associated with the bad guys, okay, and evil, okay, and it has nothing to do with race. My argument would be that it's a carryover from throughout evolutionary history. What was the most frightening time for people? The most frightening time for humans when we were hunter-gatherers was nighttime. Okay, we don't have eyes that can see well at night. Now, if you go back to where at best you had a campfire, okay, when that sun goes down, the world inherently becomes scarier. Okay, so darkness, and to use their word, remember this is their word, not mine. Darkness or blackness has always been associated with bad, with threat, with fear. Not because of any racial overtone, but because throughout history, until the invention of electricity and or even prior to that, torches, and we moved from nomadic hunter-gatherers into a more agricultural farms and villages. Okay, until that point, the minute the sun left, the world inherently became a more dangerous, more scary place. That's where that comes from. It's not inherent to race, okay? Europeans, okay, living in caves in Northern Europe and what's now Germany in the Black Forest, okay, in 900 BC, okay, or whenever in the Stone Age, okay, they were not fearing black African people. They were fearing whatever came in the night, okay? Because that's just the way it is, okay? So, sorry, I get all worked up here. Anyway, throughout the series, and often with a clunky, silly obviousness, those color-charged terms are reiterated. Consider the heavy-handed conclusion of Episode 8. With the aid of a magic black sword fragment, Adar seizes the Southlands and then tells his orc progeny they finally have a home. Cued by the human Waldreg, the orcs start chanting, "Hail Adar, Lord of the Southlands," but they are cut off by Adar, who says, "No, that is the name of a place that no longer exists." Waldreg replies, "What shall we call it instead, Lord Father?" The camera then follows Adar's gaze and pans out to a smoky, red-dimmed, and ruined landscape dominated by a live volcano. In the upper left-hand corner of the screen, the large golden title in a Tolkien-esque font reads, "The Southlands," then morphs into a burning black title, again in a Tolkien-esque font, "Mordor." The transformation is not just of appellations, but of light to dark colors. See, and this is the asinine bullshit that I have to call out, because literally just earlier in this same paragraph, she says it follows Adar's gaze and pans out to a smoky, red-dimmed, ruined landscape. But somehow the color of the word Mordor is laden with racial overtones. Okay, or consider the Númenóreans' cavalry that leaves its island and traverses, with unbelievable speed, over Middle-earth to assist a Southlands community struggling against Adar and his orc army. Bedecked in full white fish-scale armor, topped with white helmets that are adorned with long gold ponytails of white horsehair, the diverse humans of Númenor become a sea of soldiers who look as porcelain white and blonde as their fearless elfin leader Galadriel. When it comes to war, Númenor must default to whiteness. Again, interesting that you would point that out, okay, but you did not point out that the Southlanders should be darker skinned. Okay, but we all know they're going to be people that fall under Sauron's sway, so we're okay with them being white. Okay, and really, you're going with their armor and their stupid helmets? Because it looked kind of cheesy. I wasn't thinking anything about race. I was thinking, God, this looks like crap. During the ensuing battle, the camera lingers over the blonde Númenórean fighter Antamo, as he is pinned temporarily to the ground by the darker body and clothing of a dead orc, highlighting how, regardless of any efforts to lighten the orcs, this is fundamentally a clash of good and evil understood in terms of shades of light and dark. Okay, so she acknowledges that the orcs have been lightened to sort of make them more representative of the white folk, okay? But then she says, well, regardless of that, he's darker than the Númenórean, and therefore there's some racial overtones there. A closer look at how the show diversifies its cast regrettably supports this overall structure. In keeping with Tolkien's hierarchies of color, elite beings in the Rings of Power are whiter than their primitive counterparts. Episode 1 begins with what can only be described as a spectacle of elf whiteness. A group of all-white, sun-drenched elf children clad in white gowns play in the gleaming golden fields of Valinor as Galadriel sails a white paper boat, and older Galadriel provides a voiceover about how nothing is evil in the beginning, and there was a time when the world was so young. There had not been a sunrise, but even then there was light. Later, that same episode presents the hobbits, or, to be more precise, one of the 3 breeds of hobbits described by Tolkien, the Harfoots, faithful to Tolkien's account of them as browner of skin and less skilled, brave, and tall than the fairer of skin Fallowhides. The Rings of Power presents the Harfoots as a dirt-covered and unkempt group of nomadic hut dwellers who boast many members, including their leaders, Sadok Burrows, played by an absolutely wonderful Lenny Henry. They shouldn't have been pox. I'm sorry, they shouldn't. Browner of skin does not mean brown skin. It means comparatively darker, okay, compared to the quote-unquote fairer of skin Fallowhides. Okay, so as other experts on Tolkien have pointed out, what you're roughly talking about is the Fallowhides would be, in Tolkien's mind, akin to your average English British person on level of skin color. Okay, the Harfoots were browner of skin, more olive in complexion, like someone who's Italian or the south of France, or Spaniard or Portuguese. Okay, that's what that meant. It doesn't mean Pak. It doesn't mean Maori. It doesn't mean African. Okay, so she's actually in this article complaining about them overcorrecting and the fact that they were dirty. Technically, what she doesn't understand, and again, this is somebody who's talking about Tolkien in sort of, PhD level commentary on Tolkien, but clearly doesn't know a lot about Tolkien, because if you read the chapter on Concerning Hobbits, you know that the Harfoots are not supposed to be nomadic. They are described, in addition to being browner of skin, they are the ones that like to dig holes and live in the ground, and they are very sedentary. Okay, they are not nomadic. Okay, so she clearly doesn't know a lot about what she's talking about. Yes, the Rings of Power introduces wrinkles to this schema, such as the heroic Arondir, but one exceptional elf of color fails to disrupt the overall white dominance of the Tolkien world. Again, her argument comes down to there ain't enough people of color in this show. That's literally what it comes down to. And again, my argument would be, well, it was written by a white guy. White guy who stayed in his lane, as they say. Okay, wrote what he knew, as they say. Okay, so the majority of his characters are white. You want darker characters, write character. I guarantee you write characters, they will be what you know. Okay, because if not, then you're culturally appropriating. But I digress. Moreover, the show supports stereotypical associations of blackness with the natural world and wildness by rendering Arondir a sylvan or woodland elf bearing a green man on his breastplate. And the Rings of Power preserves the whiteness of mainstream elf society by isolating Arondir from it. Stationed to watch over Southland's humans, he is always remote from the elven center of Lindon. In Episode 7, he disappears from both elf society and the narrative altogether, as he and his human beloved, Bronwyn, movingly performed by Nazanin I'm not even going to pronounce her last name because I'll screw it up, relocate the survivors of the Orc War to the former Númenórean colony of Middle-earth. Such problems bespeak how the Rings of Power showrunners, boyhood friends J.D. Payne and Patrick McKay, have a near religious regard for Tolkien. Payne exhibits an almost spiritual respect for material he deems precious, and McKay has stated that he and his partner are stewards and caretakers who are treading on sacred ground. Amazon Studios chief Jen Psaki even claims that the two, quote, had such a deep connection to the material that was there from the beginning. There was no education you could do for that. It was their natural organic interest. Psaki's phrasing disturbingly echoes. All right, I'm not getting into the rest of it. Anyway, you guys understand what I'm talking about. I will vigorously take issue with folks who try to paint Tolkien as a racist. He clearly did not buy into his stuff. There's the famous thing with his response to the Germans when they were questioning his Aryan hoodness, and how he basically flipped them the bird. No, I think this whole writing, morphing Tolkien into some snarling racist who only wrote, stories of steeped in whiteness. I think it's disingenuous. Like I said, my thing is, in a day and age where, if you step outside your lane, you can be accused of cultural appropriation if you're white. Tolkien didn't. He stayed in his lane. He wrote what he knew, okay, in terms of his interest in race and linguistics, because if you study even in the barest minimum of terms, okay, I studied Indo-European languages. It wasn't my primary focus of study, but I took a course on it because when I was in college, it was interesting. You realize that language and race sort of go hand in hand. So I think that's sort of what he was referring to. I don't think it's this race-centric thing that they try to put on Tolkien and fantasy as a whole. Okay, growing up, D&D was big amongst me and my friends, and my group of friends that played D&D. We were a diverse bunch. We had Latinos, we had guys, we had girls, we had African Americans, we had Italians, Polish, Jewish. We were an eclectic mix, but that's growing up in the Bronx in New York. But we were an eclectic mix of Dungeons and Dragons fans. So this whole notion of fantasy being the realm of white folk, I don't see the validity in that argument at all. But what do I know? Let me know what you guys think down in the comments below. Have you felt this way? Do you think Tolkien is writing from this, even if it's subconscious position of, white racialism? Or just flat out racism? Let me know what you think in the comments below. Let me know if you think this author, Catherine Levezzo, that's her name, Catherine Levezzo. Let me know if you think that there's any credibility to what she's saying. I don't know. I don't agree with it. I have no problem saying that publicly. And if people don't like it, hey, I don't know what to tell you. Anyway, let me know what you think in the comments down below. Remember, if you like the video, give it a thumbs up, give it a share if you're so inclined. And if you have not yet, please subscribe. Would love to have you as part of the crew. Maybe I should come up with a name for the crew, the folks. And and if you are a returning subscriber, thank you very much. You guys are awesome. We are coming up on 400. Let's see if we can kick this thing over. Keep it going. All right, I will talk to you guys on the next one. Until then, peace.